Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So the last video I made, I said we were going to come together and review every single Star Wars book that we're going to be reading. So this year we decided to take on the Star Wars Canon Challenge, which is reading every single canon thing in the Star Wars universe, minus a few things because there's like games and comics and
it's a lot.
Yeah. The day that this one's going to be going up is the last day of Dooku Lost Jedi. We should probably tell them what we're gonna be talking about.
No, leave a mystery. You'll be surprised.
So for this review, we're going to be doing a little bit of spoiler-free thoughts, and we're going to segue into some spoiler thoughts. That way, we can kind of document our progress through all this. So why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Tyler. I'm not an expert by any means, but I do love Star Wars.
So the whole point of this whole series is Tyler introduced me to Star Wars last year. Like 2020 was the first year that I watched all the movies, but I've never even seen the sequels yet. So that's going to be all new for me too.
Yeah.
But we're going to do this in kind of a beginner expert format.
You're using the word expert liberally, which is okay.
I mean, you've been watching them since you were a kid and you played the games and
yeah.
You want to do a synopsis for the book? Do you want me to do it?
You can do it.
Okay. So, so Dooku Jedi Lost is technically the first thing in the Star Wars canon that we have now, timeline-wise.
So is the whole Star Wars Canon Challenge in chronological order?
The whole, yes.
Or are you going back and forth?
Well, so we're going to be going back and forth for a little bit because they just released the High Republic, which is 200 years before, like 200 years BBY. And so it's going to kind of flip-flop back and forth just because the books weren't released yet. But right now...
Because that's like 100 years before where we are in Dooku.
Right. So Dooku technically takes place in 90 BBY, but there's a lot of flip-flopping. So I think you can place it in a lot of different spots because you can technically read it, I think, after episode 2, because it does have multiple flashbacks in multiple different parts of Dooku's life. Because in some parts, he's like 14, and then some parts he's 50 years
later
old.
In
so
life,
you can place it in a lot of different places in the timeline. But technically, this is the earliest that we have before January 5th. When the High Republic books came out. I think it's important to note that this is it's
kind of written like a screenplay.
But it's not a screenplay because it wasn't made for a screen.
Yeah.
So it's written in a script format because it was made as an audio, and then I believe it was transcribed into a physical format later down the road. But I think that this is really meant to be experienced as an audiobook.
The audiobook has a full cast and everybody there's
sound effects and so I physically read the book up until the very end and then you listened to the entire thing. And what did you think about that?
It was really good. It was really nice. This is the first audiobook I've ever listened to that's had a full cast. And it was really nice because there wasn't a whole lot of narration, he said, she said, because you could kind of just dive into the action. So it was really entertaining. And there was sound effects, and the sound effects were funny because they were straight from the movies.
Which I would have never picked up on.
And it was really funny because like there'll be a lightsaber fight, and I could picture what movie scene they took the lightsaber sound from.
And they just reuse the same one over and over.
It's the same one. Yeah, it's like there's a lightsaber fights in there. And I think it's from Obi-Wan and Maul's fight in episode 1. And it's the same clip just over and over again, which I was like, it just made me laugh.
Yeah, I would have never picked up on it. But you've watched them so many times as a kid.
Yeah. And then sense. Like if there's a ship flying or like speeder bikes or whatever, they take the audio straight from the movies, which was entertaining.
Was there any point in the audiobook where you were lost? Like by who was speaking? Because when I was listening to it, I was glad that I had the prompts because there was a lot of parts where I felt like the voices sounded similar and I would have gotten lost because I'm not familiar with all these characters.
I had to go back a few times. There are a few scenes where if you had 4 or 5 characters all interacting with each other, it was a lot of voices. voice of Ventress was the person who did the voice in the Clone Wars.
Oh.
And so it was exactly the same. And Dooku was pretty easy to tell because he's so prevalent. It was if there's 3 or 4 minor characters where you've heard their voice some, but not a lot. It was a little, but it wasn't really too hard to follow.
So I went into this really nervous because I've only ever read Shakespeare, like, as a play. But I can definitely tell that I just always thought that I wasn't good at comprehending this type of media. But the way that they had it set up with the narration, where you had almost like a normal prose of a book, but then you had dialogue, it made it very easy to understand. Like, I was really nervous going into it. And then after a few scenes, I was like, oh, this is really easy to comprehend.
It wasn't hard to follow.
I'm really glad that I physically read it, though, because I was able to take my time. And I made a lot of notes and underlined a lot of things to look up later, because I'm just so new to everything. I don't know these terminologies yet. And after reading the second book already, I feel like I'm much more comfortable in the world. So I'm just glad that I physically read it. So I think depending on where you're at in your Star Wars journey, I think you can choose to either do one or the other, or both. I think both is an acceptable way too. So do you rate this book?
What's the scale? 13?
Let's do 1 to 10, because
1 to
it
10.
gets tricky when you do the 4.75, you know. But
4.7. I'm out of 10. I'm gonna go 8.
Why?
It was entertaining. I liked the story, and I think it's we know what happens to these characters later, but going back and fleshing out the backstory is entertaining. But yeah, I give it an 8.
An 8. Okay.
8 out of 10.
Would you recommend it to somebody that likes Star Wars?
Yeah.
To a casual fan, or?
Yeah, especially if you've seen, because the other main character besides Dooku was Ventress, and especially if you've seen the Clone Wars series, you already know all about her, and so it's a little bit of her backstory too, which was cool.
One last spoiler-free question: do you think it added to the canon? Do you think it added substance to the canon?
A little, but nothing major.
See, I thought, what I thought about it was, you've told me like the line of Padawans and Masters. So I knew going into it that Yoda taught Dooku, taught Obi-Wan, taught Dooku. Or no, I get them mixed up all the time. Taught Qui-Gon, taught Obi-Wan. But it was really cool to actually see it happen, because you see the reason why Yoda chose Dooku. And I think a lot of it was because he started seeing the dark side kind of come out. And so Yoda's like, I'm going to correct this.
Keep an eye on him.
Yeah. And so I thought that was really cool. It didn't really tell us anything new, but it just was cool to see it all fleshed out.
And because he was so talented.
Yoda,
it was abnormal for Yoda to take on an apprentice at that point. But he's like, I gotta
interfere here,
because it's a classic theme in Star Wars, which I did like about this one. There's a lot of the classic Star Wars themes that you get. Whereas the people who are extremely powerful in the Force are also more dangerous, because if they are susceptible to the dark side, not only could they do a lot of good because they're so powerful, they can do a lot of bad. And so that's that.
So we're going to give a spoiler warning right now, because, so if you don't want to know anything else, we're going to discuss a little bit more in detail scenes that happen throughout the book. But if you don't care, stick around. The first thing that I wanted to talk about were all the different characters that we saw, because we saw some characters that are new and only exist in these first few books that we never see in the movies. And then we saw some characters, obviously, like Yoda and Dooku, that we've seen before. So I wanted to just talk about which one was your favorite, which one was your least favorite, because I have a clear favorite. So who was your favorite character? I
think favorite was Sifo Dyas.
Yeah, mine too.
Was yours? Because I liked that. And that's another one where you know a little bit about him from the other
I had no clue
stuff from the Star Wars.
From what I've seen, I had no idea.
But he was the entertaining one. And he made me laugh too. Which I usually.
And seeing him fall into madness from the dark side, and seeing that it was so preventable, was really cool because is it Len? See, I physically read it, so if I mispronounce anything, it was because I didn't listen to the audiobook. So I read it as Lene the entire time, and then when I listened to the audiobook, they were saying Len. And I was like, oh, I've been saying it wrong in my head this whole time.
I think it's both. I think they just shortened it. I don't think she did him any favors because she
exposed him to the dark side because, well, he was seeing things before then.
He was, yeah. And that's another like classic Star Wars theme that they throw in where people, like some of the Jedi will try and investigate the dark side to understand it, but by
use it as an excuse to.
But by exposing yourself to the dark side, now you are risking
yourself from turning.
Yeah.
Yeah. I definitely thought that there was, like, you could see obvious corruption in the Jedi from this book because there was a lot of silencing of a lot of people. Like, for Yoda to be on the Jedi Council and to be the Master Jedi, there were other Jedi Masters there that saw what was happening to Dooku and to Sifo Dyas. They saw that, brought that to Yoda, and he was like, don't worry about it. And so it was kind of like, if you're a council, wouldn't you think that you would want to listen to all sides? And that kind of ties into the second book with adding Qui-Gon to the council.
Yeah.
Because it's like they want to have these other voices in the council, but then I feel like Yoda is kind of set in his way and is kind of like, there's one point where he's like, I've been alive for a long time and you haven't. So I've had more experience than you. And I was kind of like, I feel like for a team that's trying to do a lot of good, that only does bad when you silence people like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think this really shows like the downfall of the Jedi, like this early on.
It's like the beginning of the end for the Jedi Order.
Yeah.
And I feel I don't think it was redundant. I think it was good that there were some of the themes that you see in other stories.
Yeah, there was a lot of reoccurring things.
Because there's a lot of similarities to Dooku and his path as to Anakin.
Right.
And
that's honestly what fascinates me the most about, especially reading the prequels, because it's so interesting to see what turned these people. And I didn't realize Dooku was a Jedi for so long. Like, he was a Jedi up until his 50s. And then he turned after taking over Sereno. And so it was like, I didn't realize literally from the womb he's taken, and then for 50 years he was set in these ways, and then he turned.
Yeah. So that's those same themes that the path Anakin took in Dooku, where they have experiences with their family, and then they have a hard time letting go of their family connections and devote themselves to the Jedi Order.
Well, and it makes sense why they say cut all ties.
And then you have, they don't agree with the thinking of the Jedi Council and the Jedi, and then they're like, well, if you're not going to listen, I'm going to go do my own thing.
Yeah.
And it's very similar.
Yeah.
And then on the tail end of that, you've got Sidious coming in and taking advantage of them and their scenarios.
Yeah.
And so it makes a lot of sense that one gets traded in for the other down the road.
And it's crazy because Sidious shows up in the end of this novel. And so it's like he was pulling strings years before.
The foresight that he had, is crazy.
Yeah. And there was one scene in particular that I thought was really hard to read, and I wish I would have listened to the audiobook at this point, but Dooku was hearing voices when they were on that planet, and that was taken over by the dark side. And I could see that, like, Sidious was one of the voices he was hearing in the future. And it was like, ooh, that gave me chills because he has the foresight to know that Sidious takes him on.
It was good. You could hear Sidious referring to Dooku as his apprentice.
Yeah.
When he was in the visions.
That was cool. Yeah. I thought that was really cool.
In the visions he was having.
Yeah. Okay, so I have an obvious favorite scene.
Okay.
And I wanted to know what your favorite scene of this. I don't know if we'll go into like favorite scene later on, but since this is written as a screenplay and it was divided up in scenes, I'm curious to know what your favorite part of this story was.
No, I'm going to have to go look at it again.
My favorite one was when they were on Proto Branch. Was that the name of the planet? Proto Branch?
And the hospital.
And so it was like an agriculture planet. And in order to yield more crops, I love politics. And if you watch my channel, you know that like politics and sci-fi and fantasy is my favorite thing. But it was cool because they were producing Bacta, which is like Bacta,
yeah.
which is their healing ointment thing. And so in order to yield more crops, because this planet's cash cow, they moved everybody up onto these floating platforms to live so they could yield more crops because they were taking up too much space to live there. And I'm like, ooh, that's something that would definitely happen. I feel like in our world, like being like, we got to move all these people to Mars and just use Earth as a cash cow.
We need the land, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was really interesting. But what happens is this storm comes through and Sifo Dyas kind of sees it and prophesizes it. And it was one of those things where they were like, well, we shouldn't intervene. This is something that like the Jedi Council would never intervene in. But then someone goes behind their back to go tell the senator of that planet, like, hey, we foresee something really bad happening. And then they get there too late. And so when they're in the hospital trying to save the younglings, I thought that scene was so cool.
That was good.
Yeah. And that's when you really saw Dooku and Sifo Dyas using the Force to like save people. And that was my favorite part of the whole book. I thought that scene was so cool because I felt like I could really visualize the platforms and yeah.
That was good.
That was my favorite part. Next question is, do you think that this book enhances your experience of watching the movie? Like, do you think watching the movie again, this will give you more foresight of Dooku or any of the other characters?
I do, because it's like we were joking earlier about that, where you're like, we know of Count Dooku, and it's like, why is he a count?
In the movies, he's kind of a throwaway character.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like he's only there to serve the purposes of other people and to push along the storyline. But in this, it really gives him some humanizing type traits.
Yeah. And I think in the whole scope of his story, you have this early on, and you can see how that leads him into the position, the position as the Count of Serrano.
Yeah.
Serrano, I can't say.
Yeah, I don't know what it is either.
And then that leads into the Separatist and Republic and the Clone Wars, and then the Clone War series, and then that carries into the movies. So it all ties in together, which I think it's nice.
Yeah, I definitely, when I watched the movies, granted I'm brand new to this, when I watched the movies, Dooku was just kind of like a pain in the ass. Because he's just evil. And he's just doing whatever Sidious wants him to do. And now it's like, oh, he's got his own motives. I don't think the movies do Dooku justice at all. And so that's why I think that this, if anything, this would be a great read for anyone to pick up. Like so far, so we'll talk about that one later, but we're on to our second book. And I feel like the next one with Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, it hasn't fleshed him out as much as Dooku. This book has done for Dooku. You know, because we see there's so much screen time of Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, but for Dooku, this has just done his character so much justice, I think.
Yeah.
And I was talking to a couple people on the Discord for this chat, and they were saying, like, I never thought I would like Dooku. Like, I actually kind of like him now. And I don't know. I think that's what's really cool about this challenge. I made sure to read it really slowly because there's little tiny details in the very beginning that seem like throwaway sentences, but it gives you a lot of backstory of like why Ventress is even there. And I think that's why I'm glad I physically read it, because I actually like was making notes, like connecting the dots. Okay, so do you have any final thoughts? Was this as bad as you thought it was going to be? Sitting in front of a camera?
Oh, the camera part? Yeah, that's bad. But, you know.
It gets easier.
Okay.
It gets easier. So we're planning on doing this for every installment of this Canon Challenge, which is going to be going into February 2022. Granted that nothing else gets released. Then it'll probably get expanded. The next book that we're going to be reading is Master and Apprentice by Claudia Gray. This is more Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan backstory and kind of what happens right before episode 1 and some of the hardships that they face as being a master and apprentice, because there's definitely this thing, and Yoda says it in Dooku, where they're like, there's no other bond like a master and apprentice, like a Padawan master relationship. And you see how hard it is that Qui-Gon feels like he's being a failure because their relationship isn't the best. Because they do kind of see things differently. But I don't know. So at the time of filming this, I think I'm about halfway through, and you said you're like 75% of the way through.
Yeah.
And so I've been enjoying it. I think it's been fun.
I've really enjoyed it.
So we're planning on doing another sit-down spoilery discussion for Master and Apprentice on the last day that one is, so we don't spoil anyone. But let us know. Let us know if you guys have any questions for us. I am most active on Instagram. And I'll go ahead and link everything for this challenge down in the description, so that way you can find anything. And we will see you on our next episode. Say bye.
Bye.